I'm reading the book The Bronte Myth by Lucasta Miller. So many stories have been written about the Bronte sisters. Now, in The Bronte Myth, the author, Lucasta Miller, uses the term myth to refer to the constructed and idealized image that has been created around the Bronte family, particularly Charlotte, Emily, and Annie Bronte. The word myth suggests that there are misconceptions and distortions surrounding the lives and works of the Bronte sisters, which have been perpetuated and exaggerated over time. Miller argues, if you see, that the popular perception of the Brontes as reclusive, socially inept, or eccentric individuals living in a remote parsonage on the moors has overshadowed a more nuanced understanding of their lives and literary achievements. She contends that this myth has been perpetuated through various means, including biographies, adaptations of their works, and cultural representations, which have often romanticized and commodified the Brontes' lives. By using the term myth in the title, Miller aims to challenge and deconstruct this idealized image and reveal the complexities and realities of the Brontes' lives. She seeks to uncover the human beings behind the myth and provide a more accurate portrayal of their experiences as writers, women, and individuals living in the Victorian era. In a sense, the word myth in the title of the book suggests that there is a gap between the popular perception of the Brontes and the historical realities, and it sets the stage for Miller's critical examination and dismantling of the constructed mythology surrounding the Bronte family. And I'm reading from the preface and acknowledgements. If you see, it says that the two most famous Bronte's novels have become established not just as literary classics but as what one might call modern myths. Both Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights have burst their generic boundaries and found their way into mass culture through Hollywood, stage versions, television, and even pop music. Yet what for me makes the Brontes so extraordinary is that unlike the authors of comparable modern myths, so she writes to acknowledge that all biographies have their own agenda, and to reject the possibility of the definitive biography is not, however, to deny that there are rights and wrongs when it comes to life writings. The history of the Brontes' posthumous lives is littered with examples of apocryphal stories and fantastical claims, which can indeed be dismissed as mere myths in the commonplace sense that they have no basis in documentary fact. Yet this book is also concerned with the idea of myth in a more subtle sense of the word. Even a true story can become a myth by being endlessly repeated and woven into culture. To call an event in history mythic does not necessarily denigrate its reality or truth value, but it does acknowledge the penumbra of emotional, aesthetic, and ideological resonance which have clustered around it. So facts then, she writes, can become myths through the way in which they are packaged and perceived. So there were 3 and not 4 or 5 Bronte sisters is, for example, a historical fact, but the motive of the 3 sisters has a cultural mystic stretching back into fairy tale, which unconsciously or consciously, as when Ted Hughes calls them the 3 weird sisters after the witches in Macbeth, contributes to the sense of mystery which surrounds them. The historical accident by which 3 of Patrick and Maria Bronte's 5 daughters lived beyond childhood, grew up to develop literary talent and become famous as a trio, melds at some level in the cultural consciousness with the atavistic magic associated with the idea of the 3 sisters. As a group, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne Bronte are collectively known as the Bronte sisters, and I therefore feel I ought to offer some explanation for which this book concentrates almost exclusively on the developing biographical image of the 2 elder sisters at the expense of the youngest. She's also mentioned about how Charlotte discovered Emily's notebook that spurred her into action to write or to publish those poems. One day in the autumn of 1845, I accidentally lighted on a volume of verse in my sister Emily's handwriting. Of course, I was not surprised, knowing that she could and did write verse. I looked it over, and something more than surprise seized me, a deep conviction that these were not common effusions, not at all like the poetry women generally write. Fired by the discovery, Charlotte set about persuading Emily that such poems merited publication, and to offer some of her verse, and the 3 sisters at length decided to put together a joint volume and bring it out under ambiguous pseudonyms which, while not positively masculine, would effectively disguise the fact that the writers were women. So in their age, in the Victorian age, women were not so popular. So that is why it was very difficult in those days for women to write, women to be accepted as writers. So that is what is so fascinating with these girls. I read from the jacket. The book has its subject the manipulations of a reputation. Its starting point is Charlotte Bronte's attempt to manage her own and her sister's public image in the face of Victorian prejudice against their passionate novels. Their first biographer, Mrs. Gaskell, transformed their story of literary ambition into one of the great legends of the 19th century, a dramatic tale of 3 lovely sisters playing out the tragic destiny on top of a windswept moor. Miller reveals where this image came from and how it took such a hold on the popular imagination. Each generation has rewritten the Brontes to reflect changing attitudes towards the role of the women writer, towards sexuality, towards the very concept of personality. The Bronte myth gives vigorous new life to our understanding of the novelists and their culture, a bold attempt to unravel what Henry James described as the most complete intellectual muddle ever achieved on a literary question by a wonderful public. It is witty, erudite, and refreshingly unsentimental. Ultimately, indeed, Miller reveals as much about the impossible art of biography as she does about the Brontes themselves. It's indeed a very interesting book, and once you start reading, it has a definite flow. So, and if you have interest in the Bronte sisters, this is the book, a great biography to be read. The